So good morning. I'm sorry, what's your name?
Good morning. My name is Rubian.
Rubian?
Yeah.
Okay, so just so you know, we're recording these all presentations, record them because we put them on our website. And so I'll be talking like in general, but if you have any questions or comments, of course, you can ask me and you can pause for that, okay? But just so you know that I am speaking for the wider audience. So welcome to today's presentation, number 3 on how to improve your academic research using the DACC Library. Today, we're going to focus on scholarly sources. So, and this is just a reminder that all these presentations are recorded, and when they are ready, they will be made available on this page. It's one of the pages in our live guides and research guides, all stemming from the library's homepage. So just a reminder. And this is also a reminder of where we're at. These are 6 presentations, and we're on the 3rd one, where the blue arrow is indicating, and of course, scholarly sources. So we started off with getting ready, narrowing the topic, and then searching and finding. So we are now going to touch base on scholarly sources. So I'd like to take some time to explain what scholarly sources are. Sometimes students or other people really don't know the difference. So I'm going to elaborate on what these are, right? So in general, the definition is scholarly sources are materials. So it could be reports, research findings, a lot of examples of these materials, but that are, let me just let someone in. But that are written they're written by scholars for scholars. So it's like their formal way of communicating. And I'll explain later in the presentation why that's important. But their purpose is to share new information and advance the knowledge in that field, in that specific field. It is not to sell, make money, fame, popularity. The previous presentation, I talked about the differences between popular sources and academic sources. So this goes even further, right, into the purpose for scholarly sources, right? So I talked about some of those purposes that popular sources have, and that should be a clear indication between those and scholarly sources. So these are examples of the types of materials that are written by scholars for scholars, data, experiments, survey results. And the unique thing about scholarly sources is that they all build on each other. In other words, something is not going to get approved through the peer review process, which I explained last presentation, if it's not accurate and factual. So when it is accepted, it then becomes the newest addition, if you will, to the knowledge in that field. So it's how these experts, these researchers, grow and learn in their field. The knowledge is then shared, accepted, what have you. So they contain the latest research findings and are generally accepted in the field. And the one interesting thing about scholarly sources is that there's this thing, the more a source is cited, we have this term in library world called citation analysis, but it's the more it's cited, the more credible it becomes. So if you think about it, if there's a new research finding, that is presents new information, right, to the field. more researchers are going to cite that source to continue the conversation that this new application provided. So keep that in mind. It's a characteristic of scholarly sources, this citing of other sources. So it could be a good indicator for you to determine whether or not you want to use such a source. So when you're reviewing materials that you find when you do your initial search and you have scholarly sources in mind, whether you were told to use them or you yourself decide you wish to use them, keep in mind that we have criteria that goes into this that you will have to then interpret as you review the sources that you search for and find. So I'll be talking about for the next several slides about all of these criteria that are used to determine, right, the validity of sources and the credibility. There is an acronym that's popular and commonly used. It's called the CRAAP test. So I'll talk about all of those, what those means, but I'll also elaborate on a couple of those. So you may be familiar with the CRAAP test. If not, it's easily found online, and I'll be covering it here in the next few slides. So the first letter, the C, right, it talks about currency. So this is something that should be on a student's mind, you know, how important is the latest information? And it all depends on your topic. For some topics, it's very important, right? Science, technology, for example, medicine, they want the latest information, not stuff that's older than a year or two. Other disciplines, it may not be that important, right? Hello, guys. So go ahead and have a seat. Other disciplines, it may not be that important. If you think about history, right? You want all the information. So it depends. So keep this in mind. Currency is how recent is the information. So when you come across a resource, you should be mindful of the date it was published. So again, it depends on your topic, what you wish to get, what you're looking for. But just keep that in mind, is how old is it, and if that's an issue with you. Hello. We're talking about scholarly sources. So I'm going over the criteria that one should use when determining these types of sources. Relevance is the next criteria. CR. R is relevance. Now, this is really an internalized process that you would have to determine as you search, as you browse, as you read the materials you find for your topic. How relevant is it? And so here are some questions that can help you determine that, because ultimately the output, whether it's a paper, an essay, or a presentation, whatever it is that you have to turn in, that you have to fulfill for your classes, and especially if the resources, the bibliography, for example, are required, then a mindful instructor is gonna read, it's gonna see your presentation, what have you, and be able to tell whether you used relevant sources or not, and how you elaborated or included them in your project, in your final output, right? So it's not only for you to internalize, but it's also something to be aware of, that it's going to show in whatever you produce in your paper, for example. So how important is the information that you're finding? Again, it all depends on you, on your topic, what you're looking for. So Does the information, is it relatable? Is it obvious? Is it not obvious? And sometimes that takes some critical thinking because you may be focusing on a specific aspect of a topic. So therefore, a specific resource may not be obvious at once, or let's say from the title, but you may find information that is, and then it would be your job to demonstrate that. But keep these in mind, right, in determining the relevance. Audience, I'll have a next slide talking about audience. In the previous presentation, I talked about popular sources and scholarly sources. So the audience is different. But you, again, would have to determine whether that particular source is applicable, relevant for what you need, right? So there's more to it than just, I mean, it's easier said than done, right? But there's a lot internalizing of this that goes on. For example, is the information appropriate at the level that you need? Have you looked at a variety of sources? Do you have a good idea of what's out there and what kind of focus you may want to take? And if so, do you have the sources to support that? Right? And then are you ultimately comfortable using the source? I always caution students when they do find something, if they're not comfortable with it, they should probably look for something else, because you have to enjoy what you're researching. That's why picking your topic. Hello. That's why picking your topic is very important. But once you've determined that topic, right, your focus can change. And I talked about this in the previous presentation. But ultimately, the sources you decide to use, you should be comfortable with. You should not be struggling with them. You should not be forced to have to use them, is what I'm trying to say. So that's relevance. It's a lot, but it's an important criteria. So part of that relevance, we talked about audience, and I have talked about the different types of audience between the popular sources and the scholarly sources in a previous presentation. So again, this is something that you internalize as you're reading the source. Is it written for the purpose that you need? Does it have the factual research-based information that you want in a scholarly source, or as a popular source, is it more journalistic? So I talked about that difference last time. This is what we mean. So the language in scholarly sources are written at a higher level. Again, remember, the purpose of scholarly communication is to share information, and these scholars are experts in their field. So the language is going to be obviously at a much higher level. They use, for example, specific terminology that's common in that field. So, and then the last part about the media, you know, sometimes we hear latest research on the news, but just keep in mind that that's just once in a while they do that. That's the media's determination to make it newsworthy. But there's always scholarly communication, is what I'm trying to say. There's always scholarly communication year-round by various people. Just because the media picks it up and puts it on their news or in the newspaper, it's just the highlight. It does not affect the validity or the relevance, or you know what I mean, of that source. So sometimes the caution would be to not just depend on media, is what I'm trying to say, for your research findings. There could be a lot of gems hidden in the library databases, for example, for you to find that you don't see or hear about in the popular news. And just because it's not in the popular news does not mean it's not valid. That's what I mean about that point here, audience. So we've covered currency, relevancy, and audience is part of relevancy. So it's not part of the CRAAP. I just wanted to talk a little bit about audience here. The next one is authoritative, right? When we look at sources, we want to question who's producing this material and why, right? And one of those factors is, are they an authority? So what does that mean? Well, we look at the authors. For scholarly sources, most of the producers of this type of information, like I mentioned, are researchers themselves, experts in the field. And those credentials should be very easily found, especially on the document. If not, a simple search should be able to bring those authors' credentials up. It should be transparent. It should not be a mystery who they are, what they do, where they work, why they're doing it, right? So one of those, many of the places that do this type of research, some are commercial, some are industry companies, but many are also research, university, nonprofits, and NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So it could be, they could be working, or the source could be from any of these, including industry, but we know industry for the most part is there to make money, so just got to keep that in mind. But nonetheless, the qualifications for most scholarly communications, like I mentioned, they are doing original research, and they are at the forefront of their fields because they teach or they work at a research institution, that type of thing. So should be clearly stated and verifiable. And new and credible research should be published in a respected and reputable source, such as a well-known journal. Okay. No one really is going to go through the process of doing original research and the extensiveness that is required and not share it in a reputable source. And those within the field know what sources those are. And sometimes they aim for one or a couple. And if they don't get in, then they may have a plan B. But my point here is that if it's accepted, it'll appear in the respected sources such as these journals. So again, it shouldn't be a mystery. They shouldn't be difficult to find, but so you establish the authority of the source. Are they believable? Are they someone that is credible? Can talk on the subject. And so this is another criteria to follow when working with scholarly sources. The next A in the CRAAP, the second A is accuracy. So is it accurate? And for the most part, all the information on a research article, for example, can be verified. So we're talking about verifiable facts. The accuracy should be facts that you can verify somewhere else, right? And a lot of these research articles and findings have their bibliographies, right? Their list of references that they use. You can also view some of the resources they're using to determine its accuracy. So for example, if you come across not necessarily a journal article, but some other source that you're considering, you should keep in mind, do they reference outside work? And if they don't, that should be a question for you to determine why. So if you're at a website that's trying to sell you something, that could explain it. But for a scholarly source, it's expected to have credible sources included in their literature, right? So that's what I'm trying to say there. Are other credible sources mentioned? There should be a bibliography or a list of references, and there should be no spelling or grammatical errors. So, but the first one is really the big one in this one. Is it information that you can verify in other resources? So as you're doing your research and you have several resources that you're considering, and one of them brings up something you had not heard of yet or come across, then you should wonder about that. Is it unique, or is it verifiable? So it doesn't necessarily, it's not a black and white answer. It doesn't necessarily mean one thing or the other. This is, again, something that you have to internalize and be mindful of, right? It's accuracy. But for the most parts, scholarly communications are accurate. Now, and I'll explain why after these criteria. CRAAP, purpose, is the last one. Okay. And I've kind of alluded to it that already, right? The popular sources, the newspapers, the magazines, the publications that are written for the mass appeal, they have a different purpose than scholarly sources. I've already explained what the purpose of scholarly communication is, but still you should internalize what are they trying to what's the purpose of this communication, right? So are they trying to inform? You know, we talked about scholarly communication, bringing up the latest research, advancing the knowledge, being credible by authoritative figures, or are they trying to do something else? Are they trying to sell you something? Are they trying to persuade you? Are they entertaining you? So you should be, as a student, developing these skills to determine this on your own internally, right? When you see something, for example, this is an election year, it's a good example to see all the propaganda that is around us, both in mail and print and electronic, because these people want to get elected. So they may say things that are not necessarily true. So they're obviously trying to persuade you. That's what I mean. You need to keep this in mind. What's the purpose? Are the authors and sponsors' intentions clear? Is the information factual or is it opinion? Is it propaganda? Does the point of view appear objective and impartial? And are there political, ideological, cultural, religious, institutional, or personal biases? Now, I've done a presentation on biases previously, so if you wish, I can help you find that recording. But I will, on the next slide, go into a little bit more on the bias, on the impartiality within purpose. Again, it's not a most scholarly communications try not to be biased, and I'll explain why, but there's, I think, always a little bit of bias in everything that we do because we're humans, right? We view the world through our own lenses. So, but how can you avoid the obvious versus those that are not? So the information, as I've already repeated, should be factual, should be not opinions, should be not someone's opinions based on nothing else but fact. There should be no obvious bias, and all affiliations or associations should be noted. So when you're looking at the authority of the resource or the authors and you know their affiliations, that may be something to consider when determining whether they have bias or not, right? They may have affiliations that may present a conflict, conflict of interest, or they may. So the author should appeal to the reader's sense of logic, not emotion. Okay, thus their conclusions should not only summarize their findings, but also demonstrate a logical reasoning in their testing and hypothesis. That's in essence what scholarly sources do. Okay, they're not trying to appeal to your emotion. They're not based on opinions. You should be able to follow along logically how they came to their conclusions. Ultimately, right? So keep this in mind. Again, none of these are black and white. It's going to be, maybe the currency one. We talked about that if you have a topic. But so these are things you need to think about as you come across, and these skills develop with time. So those were the criteria. Those are what are part of the CRAAP test. So those are common universal criteria to determine evaluating the sources, right? So now I'm going to talk about more about specifically research articles and findings. The last presentation, I talked about the difference between type and format, types of sources and the format of those sources. And so an article and a book are different types of sources, but a book and an ebook are just different types of format. So again, I talked about that last. So the journal article is the type of source. The fact that you found it in a database, that's the format. Before computers, everything was in print, so there wasn't an issue. Now with computers, that could be muddied a little bit, But know that all journal articles come from a journal. And that journal may still produce in print or may be totally electronic. But that is just a difference in format, not necessarily in type. So keep that in mind. And when you come across journal articles that are research-based, they're normally broken up into these sections. Okay, they have an abstract, an introduction, literature review, methodologies, analysis, and conclusion. Again, remember that logic that I was talking about? This is why they break it up into chunks to focus on each of these. Some may have all of these, some may have more, some may have less, but in general, these are the parts that are most common in research articles found in journals. Any questions? So why is research so important? And I'm talking about like research findings, research articles, conclusion. Why is that so important? Well, because research, remember I talked about the logic that is required. They go through these parts to prove to you and it's transparent, and you too or anyone else could come to those same conclusions, right? There could be a little difference at the end, but how they got there should be very clear. And so I'll talk real briefly about some of these parts. So universality, when researchers do a research experiment, for example, how they set it up and the conditions and the environments and the factors that went into it should all be replicable. In other words, someone else should be able to duplicate that on their own if they wanted to. That is a sign of the universality of research, right? Again, they're being very transparent. Their intentions are not to sell you, you know what I mean? They're not trying to appeal to your emotions. You can reproduce that experience yourself. And in fact, in science, it's almost required over and over again, because the more you do it and the consistency of the outcomes then becomes generally accepted knowledge in the field. So the universality is one of the reasons why research is very important. The other one is replication. Like I said, anyone should be able to replicate that experiment and be consistent in the outcomes that if they follow exactly as they did that they're reading in the journal article. So replication is another reason why research is very important. Control. These are the parameters, the factors that they're dealing with in the experiment or in the research. And those criteria that they use should be very transparent, logical, they should make sense. So for example, in an experiment, the factors should be documented and noted about each and every step that they took. Whereas the different types of, the other types of research may include survey or historical. So the factors that go into creating the experiment should be very clear. And that's what this slide is talking about. The control is clear with all the factors that go into it. And then the last one is measurement, right? So the observation, the collecting of the data, the measuring of the data should all be transparent. And again, you should be able to follow logically how they came to the conclusion. So it's more difficult in survey and historical research because it's more of a subjective answer that you're looking for. Whereas in controlled experiments, it's more objective because of these steps, these criteria. So for students, I think the most important thing of today's presentation is that when you're tackling an assignment, a research project, and it's something that you're trying to find an answer to or you're trying to solve, you want to make sure you develop conceptually the research problem. So what does that mean? So conceptual thinking is inquiry and insight, things that are required of you to think critically and be able to express, whether it's in writing or an oral, if it's a presentation, versus just collecting data and making comparisons. Okay, so there is what this slide is trying to indicate is that students need to internalize what they're finding and come out with something conceptually developed, right? So, for example, you should have a goal, and that goal should be a statement of the problem, if that's the type of research that you're doing. You should have a purpose statement or a question that you're trying to answer. So a lot of instructors, especially in English, communication, and other fields as well, have assignments where they want you to come up with a question, or they give you the scenario and you're supposed to solve it. So that's what this means. It requires a student to internalize the problem and do more than just collect data and make comparisons. Insight is required of the student. And so that happens when you, that's why it was very important earlier when I mentioned that you need to pick a topic that you like, because this is going to be very difficult if you don't like the topic, right? You're forced to do something, research in an area, you know, that really doesn't have your interest. You're going to have a challenge developing that concept. But if it's something that you really are interested in, then it should come much easier. That's what this slide means. So you have a goal, you have a purpose, whether it's a question or a statement, but you're trying to find something out, right? And that process is what I think most instructors are trying to help you develop, to be clear in that process that you're trying to do. And it's easier when you attack it from a problem or a wide standpoint, right? And you want to base it on what the research is about. What is the research telling you? And what does the evidence say? So keep this in mind when you're working on a research project. It's especially if you can be quite clear and obvious in your writing or presentation why it is you're doing or searching for what you're searching for. There should be a purpose. So any questions? These are meant to be 30 minutes. This is just a reminder. This is our library's homepage. All our presentations can be found here. If you need help, I can help you. So this is just a reminder. The blue arrow up there is showing you our library's homepage, the URL. And then once you're there, you would click here to the library presentations and they're all listed. That was that first slide I showed you. So this is just a reminder where to go, where you can find those. But in summary, so we're wrapping it up now. When do you use scholarly sources? Well, when you're told by the instructor, right? And most of the times it's going to be in the directions or the instructions. But you may also choose to use scholarly sources when you're not told, for the reasons we've already covered, right? They're different. They're written by experts. They're timely. They advance knowledge in the field. All those reasons would help you determine yourself whether or not you want to use a scholarly source for an assignment, whether you were told or not, right? So when facts and logic are valued, not emotion, not propaganda, they're not trying to sell you something. It's authoritative, organized, and it generates interest and discussion. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been published. It wouldn't have been accepted. Whereas in a popular source, that process is not included. It has a different, journalism editor relationship type. This is more transparent, accepted, credible, highly reputable sources. That's when you would use scholarly sources. If you have a topic that is more contemporary or indicative of current events, or what is I'm trying to say, popular culture, that's what I wanted to say, then that's a different topic. You're going to be looking at different sources, probably, but you could probably not scholarly, but I bet you could find some scholarly. So consider them. But again, how usable is it? That relevance piece is, you're gonna have to determine that. Right? It's ultimately up to you. The objective is to allow you to find all of these sources, and then you ultimately make that decision as best you can to make the best product that you're supposed to, whether it's writing a paper or giving a presentation, because we've talked about its validity. There are better sources than others. That's just how life is. Any questions? Well, thank you for coming. This is my bibliography. The next presentation will be on the 19th. Part 4 is on critical evaluation. And thank you for coming. If you guys need verification that you were here, just let me know and I'll be glad to do that.